Hi, everyone. This is Lindsay O'Donnell Welch with Decipher, and I am joined today by Mick Baccio, Global Security Advisor with Splunk's Security Research Team. Mick, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me on, Lindsay.
Yeah. So you have a lot of experience in the private sector and in roles across various government departments, and you even served as the first CISO for a US presidential campaign a few years back. But kind of dialing it all back, you started your career in the US Navy. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
So the day I joined the Navy, I joined the Navy like a lot of folks. I think I was 19. Military was the way to go. And the day I joined the Navy is the day I found out I was colorblind. And I scored pretty high in the ASVAB. I was supposed to be a nuclear engineer. And hey, you're colorblind, red wire, green wire. That's super important in this field. How about computers? They said, we looked at your file said you're good at computers, go do that. So that's kind of when I got my start. So spent time in the Navy, learned a lot really fast, really quickly, the importance of operations, the importance of prioritization, probably a lot more than a 19-year-old should be responsible for. And then, after that, kind of bounced around a little bit in the InfoSec scene, and then started working for Lockheed Martin as part of an HHS contract, the Department of Health and Human Services, to build out the Computer Security Incident Response Center, like a department-wide effort. When you think of HHS, it's I think roughly 25% of 25 cents of every tax dollar goes to HHS. It's just a huge, huge organization, and what a security program looks like for that. And then after spent some time at the CDC as part of their incident response and security operations program, ran a team at the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and then found myself at the Pentagon running an incident response team there, where the Pentagon, the building is everything like you think it's going to be. It's 30,000 people walking in, walking out every day. That kind of network, all the branches of military, you're supporting that, and all those ancillary efforts as well. It's an amazing thing. Then back to HHS, because I guess I like big organizations and help build out a threat intelligence program. So, when you think of an organization as large as Department of Health and Human Services, what threat intelligence looks like for that. And then found myself at the White House at the through the Obama administration and into the Trump administration, running a threat intelligence team, which that's everything you thought of. Yeah, the 2016 election, running a threat intelligence team there, through the election, the transition, next administration, and then after I left the government, I was asked to run security for the Buttigieg campaign. I got a call one day, hey, do you know Pete Buttigieg? And I was like, not really. Let me look it up. And I was like, oh, Mayor Southend, got it. And being the first CISO of a presidential campaign, my first reaction was no. Having spent the 2016 election at the White House, I wanted nothing to do with that. But speaking with some friends, and it's a once in a lifetime opportunity, I leaned into it, and hopefully, I think I did pretty well, and kind of advanced the role of cybersecurity, the place of cybersecurity in that campaign ecosystem. And then after that, I found myself at Splunk, part of a research team called Surge, where we kind of tackle those, rare security problems, those offbeat security problems. Shannon Davis did some work. How fast does ransomware encrypt? A peak method for threat management and how to prioritize incidents and incident response by David Bianco, and a lot of work. And our most recent work was the AI phishing experiment we did with Tamara, for whether AI email or translated email is better or faster or more effective.
Mhm.
So it's those weird cybersecurity problems that we get to tackle here at Surge, and it's coming up on 4 years here. So I'm really, that's from there to here. It's really been a weird journey. It's been great. It's been awesome. But from the Navy to just cybersecurity research, here at Splunk, it's pretty awesome.
So when you look back at all these specific different experiences, like was there one that you felt defined your career, or more like generically kind of shaped the overall impact that you want to make in the cybersecurity landscape?
So for me, I think I can trace it back to two specific moments. The first, I was super young and I read a book called Neuromancer by William Gibson. And it was when I fell in love with the idea of cyberspace and just that separate digital world that exists and all the possibilities inside of that and what it's like to just operate at a machine level and the possibilities there. And I was like, I want to do that. And I wasn't sure what it meant, but apparently it meant being colorblind and ended up doing computers in the Navy and transitioning from there. And the second is there was a report or something that happened around 2012, maybe a little earlier, called Operation Aurora, where it was an intelligence organization that compromised a bunch of companies globally, and that was my first firsthand experience with that kind of cyber attack, and that just fascinated me how that can occur. And I think from cybersecurity into threat intelligence is when I made that transition, just wanting to learn as much as I could. And I think those two big moments, reading a book as a child that was about this computer world and seeing a global attack by an intelligence organization was just those two things kind of shaped the direction of just all the possibilities with data. And I think that's kind of basically what I do now in my role is, I think all of us push data around. We keep data from where it's not supposed to go and let data go where it's supposed to. And it's just the better ways that we can find to do that more efficiently, without error, repeatable, and that's really, really why I love what the research we do at Splunk is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious where you were when Operation Aurora was kind of playing out. Like, at what capacity were you viewing it?
I
You know,
was
there.
a security analyst at the Centers for Disease Control and Response, or Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in Atlanta, and part of the team there. And we saw a lot of things that were happening, and it was just fascinating to see how wide about it. You read about it in the papers. It was a fascinating experience, and look back how far ago that was, how long ago that occurred. And there were incidents before that, but that was my first, like I said, exposure to it. Um, and to see where we are now, just the evolution of those attacks and those organizations, and also on the other side of it, because of my background, the evolution of network defense and blue teams and the tools available, that have kind of raised the bar cat and mouse game for the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years now.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean it's funny. That's you know over a decade ago, which is crazy. But
Mhm.
seems like a lot has changed, but also not that much has changed within cybersecurity in terms of all the different things that people are doing and the awareness, and it just a lot of these things seem to go full circle.
So yes, but I'll push back on that a little bit, in that I, no matter what the minuscule advances in security, I think we don't see the forest for the trees. We see the small granular things, those small steps we make every day, but we don't see how far we've come. 10 years ago, cybersecurity was on the tips of no one's tongue.
Mhm.
There was very rarely a CISO position, at a C level that far back.
Yep.
In smaller organizations. And I think when you look at the evolution of cybersecurity, it also includes the elevation of cybersecurity into that mainstream context where, the CISO report, like we mentioned, 90% of the CISOs have governing board, that they report to.
Mhm.
And years ago, that just wasn't a thing. um, like almost half of the CISOs we talked to report directly to the CEO, where years ago they just didn't exist. It was the CTO or the CIO. You just wore multiple hats, and I think security has gotten so much more important. You see, through legislation, through regulation, where cybersecurity becomes an important facet of the business.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, to your point about the CISO, like, and the different like levels of awareness that boards of directors are starting to gain and higher up executives about security, and even from being in the media, like the fact that we're seeing more headlines around cybersecurity, not just within kind of the smaller cybersecurity industry, but like across the more generic media too.
Right, and you see it in media as well, TV shows, popular culture. I'm also a goon at DEF CON, the annual, hacker convention in Las Vegas. And this year is the first year it's a Las Vegas Convention Center. And something of that scale and size goes to show you, how large just the idea of cybersecurity has gotten. Um, and to your point, like the priority of cybersecurity has gotten so important, as has the expense.
Mhm.
All the attacks that you see, not just the good things, but the bad things as well. All of those stakeholders that are involved are that board of directors now, and they're looking for a return on investment. What are we investing in, and what are we getting out of that, and how is that helping us? I think those are conversations that CISOs are having now, where years ago they just weren't part of that conversation. So
Yeah.
it
Mhm.
becomes important to speak the language, I guess, of the board, where I have always stressed in my career, to people that I've mentored, people that I talk to, your soft skills are super important. Being technical will obviously help you in your career,
Mhm.
but being able to speak the language of business and being able to translate those technical things into value and to speak to someone at any level outside of security becomes super, super critical now.
Mhm.
I understand you need a new sim, or need a new logging system, or we need to capture XYZ, or need to implement this new policy, security policy that's going to cost this many hours and cost, which translate to this many dollars. What does that do for the business? And being able to explain that to a board, to an executive, to the CEO, I think becomes super critical for leadership in the security community.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. You know, this kind of is somewhat related to that, but you've been both in the private and public sector, and you've worked for, as you mentioned, the Department of Health and Human Services, the CDC, like as well as like Lockheed Martin and some other companies. How have these experiences in private versus public differed from a cybersecurity perspective as it relates to kind of those more high level conversations?
I think that your stakeholders are different. Um, So your messaging needs to change according to your audience who you're talking to. If you're working for the federal government or part of that infrastructure, budget is a different conversation than if you're working in a private company. The prioritization becomes different in the public sector because a lot of times it's based on what you're required, what you're regulated to do. If there's new an executive order or an emergency directive or something from DHS comes out that you're required to implement. In the private sector, I'd say it's more regulatory driven, where you have these compliance mechanisms in place that you have to abide by as a business.
Mhm.
And balancing those, I think as a security whole, it becomes the same. Like I mentioned, the foundation is the same in principle, but after that it becomes so complex depending on one, public sector, private sector, that weird in between space, and also the direction of what you want to get out of your security program. We've seen the adoption of zero trust models, when years ago it was a defense in depth model. So I think as the internet changes, as the global tech structure changes, companies will have to adapt to it. You weren't very web driven during the Project Aurora days or Operation Aurora days, and now I think it's a very, very web centric world.
Mhm. That's a really good point. And you've helped really develop security and incident response programs at places like the CDC and, as I mentioned before, like Department of Health and Human Sciences Services, and help them to kind of work to build out their operating procedures for, different processes. I'm curious, as these different things change and as new technologies pop up, how can you make these processes more scalable and adaptable to those different changing models, if that makes sense? Is that something that's built in from the beginning?
Well, yes and no. I think, as the world adapts, you adapt to it.
Mhm.
One of the more common things that we're seeing now is something called living off the land, right? Where attackers will basically, instead of using a program to attack your network, your environment, they'll use existing programs, right? They'll use something that's already in use on your network. So that old adage, hey, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. becomes more like looking for a needle in a stack of needles.
Mhm.
And that's where contextual information becomes more important. That's where we see the adoption of AI. It's where we see the adoption of large language models that can help us sort through a lot of chaff and add that contextual information and feed that to a person and then respond to the alert. Automation, I think, becomes really, really important when you start looking at things at scale, when you start looking at just how complex things have gotten and just the ecosystem that's available to you. Yeah, I think it's amazing. You know, even we talk about the evolution of just the network in general, just the capabilities. On the other side, you know, you look back at using that operational as a time frame. Ransomware is wildly different now than it was, let's say, a 2015 era, where it's not just you clicked on something, your computer is locked down, and that's it. Now ransomware is, you know, the entire organization is crippled, and no one can do anything, and the ransoms are in the millions, you know, tens of millions of dollars. It's just the evolution of that is just it's fascinating, but at the same time it's morbid and horrifying and requires a response globally, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's you point out something that's really important, which is like the impact of certain cyber attacks and how those change too. And, for ransomware, as you just pointed out, it's maybe that is having an operational impact, or maybe there's a lot of attackers are moving to more of a double extortion model, and that makes it a little more difficult to contain how you respond to these threats. So I think that's also something that we need to kind of keep an eye on as we move forward, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think you know, going back to some of the data in the CISA report that we put out last October, it was 90% of CISOs out there expect to have an incident that will impact, you know, operations, uh, and that's terrible. And I think when you look at, you know, business email compromise is the number one thing. It's been the number one for quite some time, and in my opinion, it'll only grow because it doesn't impact operation. If someone scams money out of your organization, it doesn't stop your organization from working, um, because it's generally lower level. But something like ransomware, like that extortion, where, you know, you're locked out of your systems or your data is for sale to anyone who wants to buy it, I think that is definitely a more immediate impact that's noticeable, especially when it's published, especially when there was required you know, disclosure to the SEC. And I think those things changed the life of a CISO more than anything that has, you know, occurred incident wise in the past, you know, 10 years or so. I think those changes elevate cybersecurity to the point where it becomes a critical facet of the business. And CISOs like, I hope you adopt. That's really it's scary out there, but it's really a grow up fast. It's definitely the your seat at the table now. What are you going to do with it? And we'll see.
Yeah. Yep. That the CISO report you talked about too from October, there were a lot of really interesting takeaways there as it relates to AI, and obviously over the past year, generative AI has become a very widely and discussed and hot topic. What were some of the for you like some of the top uh, insights into AI and as it relates to what CISOs were saying and businesses and enterprises?
So, you know, we've gone a few minutes now. We haven't talked about AI, so I think that's a record in 2024.
Yeah.
What got me was 70%, you know, believe that AI gives the advantage to attackers over defenders.
Mm.
And I I'm not sure if I agree, but I don't have enough data to push back on it, which speaks to, you know, just the volume of attacks themselves. And I think that when you look at whether an attack is AI generated or not, Tamara Chacon on our team, Surge, did some research we presented last winter at Gov Summit that basically, hey, if you were attacking someone and you want to write a phishing email, what is better? Is it better to type the email and throw it into like a translation system, or to just go to a generative AI and say, write me something in French, write me something in Farsi, um, or to go find a native speaker and have them do it?
Mhm.
And really, there's not a lot of difference right now, depending on the language, because the biggest differences we found were Farsi it couldn't parse left to right, right to left, so the language was off completely.
Hmm.
Because a lot of the large language models are trained on Roman letters, Roman lettering systems. So if we're approaching it from the eyes of, I'm a Westerner trying to attack someone else, it doesn't have an advantage. But let's say I was a non English speaking attacker, then it would definitely benefit me to craft a more believable email. And I
Hmm.
think that's what we're seeing. The attackers have the advantage. But I'll point to Rob Joyce's statements at Fordham University back in January or this year, and he said that the large language models, the AI systems, are actually helping defenders because when you look at doing the same thing over and over, it's helping shed those, bring those small details of light that a human might miss.
Hmm.
So when you look at something that's super complex, a multi-step process like scanning for vulnerabilities across an entire ecosystem, incident response workflow that's multi-step, that's where something like automation can come into play because you're doing the same repeatable thing over and over again. Where if you inserted a human and kept a human in that process, there's going to be prone to mistakes. We're people. It's what we do.
Hmm.
But there's also the contextual analysis that I don't think that AI would be able to add right now. And I think that's what gives the defenders the advantage.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Like, and a lot of the same advantages that AI is giving defenders, like making things more fast, more efficient, are also ironically were what were cited by CISOs as potentially being able to be leveraged by attackers. So I think there is kind of the dual use there.
If I was a lazy bad guy, I would 100% take advantage of automation. It just makes sense for me as a lazy bad guy. So it stands to reason, yes, they're taking advantage of the same technologies. Um, but I do think that just because my background in network defense and in blue teams, I'm just always going to hold out hope that the advantages will also be to that community. Um, I do think that there has been a fair amount of time that's gone by in the private sector, in that commercial side of the house, and companies are more, I guess, able to produce products now that have AI better ingrained into the products that will aid net defenders and organizations out there. And I think that wasn't there a year ago. So I think it's just, the time to adopt, the time to implement has become so important.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of adopting and implementing, um, when you look at AI, like everything from an enterprise perspective is going to be needed to be reevaluated, whether that's like security controls or like data governance policies. How can organizations best prepare themselves for the adoption of AI use cases or how this will kind of play out within their enterprise companies?
So it's really, I mean, AI buzz is it's everywhere. So I think it's going to require a lot of flexibility. I think the public sector and the private sector, I think was what 2/3. I think it was about 2/3 of them, the respondents were already using AI technology. So, and I think over half said we were using AI technology as part of that automation that I mentioned. When you have these complex data lakes, when you have these huge multi-step processes that you have to ensure the processes run smoothly without the automation, all automation is going to do is speed something up and make it repeatable. So if it fails on its own, it's just going to speed up that failure. So having solid processes and having those repeat, the biggest ones, going back to Rob Joyce's comments, when you look at AI monitoring, I think a third of the folks were that can help us out with, our AI monitoring, risk assessment, and analysis of threat data. Given my background in threat intelligence, you consume and parse a lot of data from a lot of different sources, and being able to normalize that and interpret that and just kind of contextualize that loosely where you can put those pieces together as an analyst and as a net defender becomes super helpful.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we'll have to. I feel like we're in a pretty exciting point with AI and cybersecurity where I think there are all these opportunities, and I'm really curious to see how they play out. I don't know how you're feeling, but
I did a webinar recently with some folks from Treasury and talked about how they were adopting AI in their models. And I'm a network defense guy. I will stay in my lane. I dabble in threat intelligence. It's really
yeah.
what I like. Um, but when you look at something like Treasury, and one, they're doing the same thing with their security program, but you're also looking to improve the customer service experience because you're also a business. At the end of the day, you have to serve those stakeholders and improve that. And those small things like the AI chatbots that you see on websites that are becoming more and more prominent are using generative AI models to drive customer experience and kind of raise that up for everyone that interacts and for those stakeholders. And I think that's another use case that as a net defender, I'm not going to think about, but has really, really been paying dividends for organizations.
hmm Right, right. Well, it will be really interesting to see kind of where this all goes, but um, you know,
Regulation.
yeah, regulation, because that
And
seems like it's just starting. Like the frameworks are start. It's being thought about. I
So
don't.
go back to October of 23, the White House released, the administration released, an AI Bill of Rights, where there was ethical principles behind it.
Mhm.
Shortly after, there was the statement with the Office of Science Technology Policy about AI. And then I believe it was seven, was it seven? Might have been more, the leading AI companies, hey, we're going to develop AI responsibly and ethically. And, looking at our survey, basically about half the respondents where trust is going to be a huge, huge issue
Mhm.
with large language models and these generative AI systems. And I think with regulation, with those promises, it starts from there. But to your point, yeah, I think it's very, very nascent. But we're at least like we said, that strong foundation is there, and from after that, whatever we decide to build is built. But having those strong foundations in place, I think, are what people are most concerned about.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point because the people who are developing these models, like the people that are going to be ultimately using and having the use cases, like they're not going to be in charge of how these models are being developed and what goes into them. And I mean, I think it's going to be a bit dangerous to see how that plays out and what that means for potential. uh,
I'm optimistic. I really, really am. I think two-thirds of the folks we talked to said, "Hey, regulations are the way to go," and which is weird. Like over two-thirds of folks, yeah, more regulation is great, which is something you don't hear very often. But I think when it comes to something like artificial intelligence and the large language models, I think just the potential for good and bad is so heavy on both sides that regulation is really going to give people that sense of trust. When you look at things foundationally, even going back to Maslow's hierarchy, it's that safety and security, establishing those things when using generative AI and LLMs. Without those, they kind of become worthless after that. So establishing that, I think regulation is a solid first step.
Yeah, definitely. And then I wanted to ask you real quick before we finish up here, but there has been a lot of other regulation, beyond AI, like within the cybersecurity space. And, um, there's also been, I would say, like a greater focus on cybersecurity, especially after, Colonial Pipeline and some of these other incidents that have happened over the past few years. Um, Part of that has involved, announcements of collaboration between private and the public sector. And, having worked in both sectors, I'm really curious how you feel about that and, what your perspective is there.
So I have had the opportunity to be a part of trust groups, joint task force details, just cybersecurity, the community in general, just friends I've made, those public-private partnerships on both sides of the table, which was really, really a unique experience. So at the core, any sharing is better than no sharing. And you can get really, really granular about the level of effectiveness of these programs and but I think they're always helpful because if it benefits one person, then it's completely worth it. And I think that information would only be better served to make it more available to a broader audience. And I think where the fault goes, the collaboration might seem like it ebbs and flows, but it's always there. And I think that's one of the constants in the security community that really, really helps to benefit is that if you're an organization, if you're a person, if you're a business out there that is looking for assistance in cybersecurity or with your program or with, just your general posture, there's likely someone that you can talk to that will do it just because they enjoy talking about cybersecurity. And I think that's where that collaboration, those groups really, really come in handy is establishing that sense of community in the stakeholders, whether it's your vertical, whether it's, based on your business line or based on a threat actor specifically. I think that collaboration is always, always a good thing.
Yeah, yeah, I think we're lucky to be in an industry where like I feel like people are really passionate about the different little segments within cybersecurity they're in, whether that is like, OT security, whether
It
it's
is wild, isn't it? I met someone over the summer at DEF CON, and have you ever heard of AgSec?
no. Well, I agricultural security.
Agricultural security, and I had and just to meet someone and just their level of passion about making, it's bigger than ICS because it's ICS and OT. It's just an amazing, amazing thing. And in that level of passion in the community, to your point, you'll find someone that wants to make it better because they realize how serious it really is at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah, I love that because I think a lot of some of these sectors too are kind of under resourced and don't have kind of those budgets that they need. So they do need that passion and expertise there. Um, all right, well, Mick, thank you so much for coming onto the Decipher podcast. It was great talking to you.
It's great being here. Thank you for having me again.
Awesome, thanks so much.